Dear audience, it is a great pleasure to introduce Professor Kathrin Hörschelmann, Professor of Cultural Geography at the University of Bonn. She is internationally recognized for her work at the intersection of geography, childhood and youth studies, and critical social research. Through her work, she has made important contributions to debates on security, insecurity, and geopolitics, foregrounding the importance of integrating the perspectives of children and young people into these debates. Her research bridges the geopolitical and the mundane, showing how global and transnational processes, such as militarization, war, forced migration, and state security, are lived, negotiated, and contested by children and young people in their everyday environments. Rather than seeing children and young people only as citizens in the making, her work invites us to recognize them as reflective subjects whose perspectives offer important insights into contemporary social and political challenges and research. Her work also provokes us to rethink whose experience and whose security matters, how violence is normalized, and what it means to grow up in increasingly militarized societies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kathrin Hörschelmann.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and the opportunity to give this lecture today on the issue of militarization, the militarization of children and young people. It is work that I commenced in round about 2010, following on from research in Great Britain as well as in Eastern Germany on geopolitical identities and geopolitical perspectives of young people. Today, however, I am in the position of presenting some materials and some thinking that has emerged from this and involves the work of others. First and foremost, Lukas Dresen, who is now conducting a PhD in my research group. I am supervising his work, but we have already also co-researched, worked together, and so I would like at the start of the lecture to definitely acknowledge Lukas's contributions to some of the work, and of course also my excitement that this work is continuing. The title of the talk, Mind the Gap, is in many ways already indicating the main argument that I wish to make in this lecture, which is that there is a gap, a significant gap between democracy and military politics, as well as between the citizenship of young people and children on the one hand, and their military recruitment on the other hand, their depoliticization and their repoliticization for military purposes. So this gap, in many ways, stands in the center of my talk and of my lecture. I would like to engage you and engage with you later in the discussion around that provocation. What does it mean to mind the gap? And I would like to move towards the suggestion that we should work the gap between democracy and military politics, and the gap between young people as depoliticized persons and young people as repoliticized persons. So moving from minding the gap to working the gap. And in doing so, I want to address a paradox that young people and children are in fact central to military politics, yet they are often absent in our debates. Their voices are very frequently absent. And instead of trying to eradicate the paradox and the contradiction, what I would like to argue is that the paradox is systemic. It is not accidental. Recruitment of children and young people is in fact structural and systemic. But we will not be able, I believe, to completely eradicate the paradox. And so also here, my proposal is that we work with the paradox, we work with the contradictions that surround military politics and security politics more widely in liberal democracies. And of course, I'm not the first one to come up with this idea. There is now a very large body of research, especially on the militarization of childhood and youth, as well as long-standing debates on so-called civil-military relations, going back to the debates between Huntington and Jankowski. My main argument, drawing on Helen Brocklehurst here, is that when we consider militarization, we ought to place generational relations as relations of power in the center of our discussions. It is those generational relations as relations of power that are central to enabling war. We ought to consider the structural components of defense and the state's ability to execute its monopoly of violence and to include here children and young people. And so let me conclude my very brief introduction with that statement again, that what I'm looking at are some of those contradictions that arise from that positioning. But let me first of all introduce the concept of militarization briefly. Militarization, according to Geyer, involves the contradictory and tense social process in which civil society organizes itself for the production of violence. Kathrin Lutz explored the concept a little further and suggests that militarization represents an intensification of the labor and resources allocated to military purposes, including the shaping of other institutions in synchrony with military goals. It is a simultaneously discursive process that involves a shift in general societal beliefs and values in ways that are necessary to legitimate the use of force, the organization of large standing armies and their leaders, and the highest taxes and tributes used to pay for them. And that reminds us that we are confronted with many of these questions today, as many of our societies are undergoing an increase in spending on the military, an increase in focus on defense politics at the bare minimum. And so militarization is intimately connected, not just to the outward manifestations of increasing the size of armies, increasing military spending, but also includes more intricate processes, the less visible deformations of human potentials into hierarchies such as those of race, class, gender, and sexuality, and to the shaping of national histories in ways that glorify and legitimate military action. And let me say at this point already that it is this particular element of militarization that makes it so risky at a time of rising far-right populism, which is also characterized by a conservative move towards abandoning blame, abandoning guilt for past crimes, and glorifying national identities and national histories in a particular way. And so I want to talk a little bit more about this perhaps overarching gap in military politics. When we're looking at militarization, we are also looking at a deep contradiction in democratic politics. The contradiction between a prioritization often of military goals, but also the certain secrecy that surrounds military agendas and you might say has to surround those military agendas. There is a limit to how much we as the public can know. There is a limit to how public information can be, especially in the media age. At the same time, that very limit then produces a paradox and a gap in democratic politics, for we are no longer enabled as fully enfranchised, fully informed citizens to partake in military decision-making and to partake in those fundamental decisions about what defense means, what security means, and to what extent as a society we, in quotation marks, are prepared to change some of our ways of being, and who should be doing that so-called military job, which some would argue is just like any other job. I would continue to argue, no, it is not. And especially at the moment, criticism of the military, of militarization and of rearmament is increasingly constructed as a security risk. Now, I am not a complete pacifist. I would say that at the start, okay? I am not a real politics person either, but it would be naive, in my opinion, to ignore some of the increasing risks. At the same time, I am not sure I am fully informed. And even if I am fully informed, do I know as a citizen enough about the risks and about the consequences of certain actions to fully participate in democratic deliberation? I would argue that at the moment, actually asking for that right has become very difficult because it is immediately associated with questioning the military, questioning security politics as we encounter it today, and therefore actually exposing us as a society to increased risk. And I am aware I'm speaking here in Finland, and so I did do a little bit of research in advance as well on militarization in Finland. I'm very aware that this probably strikes even more of a chord here than it does in Germany. In Germany, we have our own very, very specific debates, and I'm looking forward to discussing those with you later. But there is a question of what do we do at this historical moment? Do we need to demand a right to find out more, to debate more, to encounter and discuss military politics so that we can take fully informed, or better informed, let's be more modest, better informed decisions? I would argue yes, together with Kiesman, with Woodward and Duncanson, with Basham, with Bulmer, that there is a need for debate and for a search for answers that minimize the burdens and risks of rearmament. With Berg and Fredrickson, I would also argue that militarization does indeed shrink the space for critical voices or alternative analyses of security. As feminists, Berg and Fredrickson argue that they know that when matters of war and national hard security dominate the political agenda, there is a sense of urgency, and that sense of urgency limits the space for alternative, non-militarized responses and democratic debate. As I indicated earlier, this is not an entirely new phenomenon, though. And certainly speaking within Europe and within a context such as Finland, coming from Germany, having lived in the UK, in Great Britain, I'm obviously very aware of some of the historical continuities of these debates and discussions, but also some of the consequences when we give up our liberties. Manitz has re-engaged with that question through the prism of the scholarship surrounding civil-military relations. And she also identifies a gap here, a value gap between civilians and the military, but a value gap that is not set in stone and not lived in the same way across different contexts. It is a value gap that actually means we need to ask, how is that gap, if there indeed is one, between civil society and the military? How is that gap negotiated? How are contradictions bridged and breached? Are soldiers citizens in uniform? That is the definition in Germany, which means you do not lose your rights as a civilian. You are tried in an ordinary court. Or are we asking for uniformed soldiers as part of a professional army, which could also mean, such as in the UK, that soldiers actually fall outside of the remit of ordinary democratic society to a certain extent, which means they are tried in military courts. And therefore means we are asking people who are supposed to defend democracy, defend society, to give up some of their rights in return. I've just spoken a lot about gaps, but let me also address continuities. It is not just feminist scholarship, but feminist scholarship in critical international relations, critical geopolitics, critical security studies particularly, that says, hang on a minute, this is a little bit too quick. Because if we emphasize the gaps and we emphasize discrepancies only, what we are ignoring are some important continuities. Opposing or assuming that civil society is separate from the military means we no longer see some of the continuities. And yet militarization involves continuities. It actually involves producing continuities between the military and civil society. Deborah Cowan with Emily Gilbert, but particularly Deborah Cowan, has made that argument in relation to Canada in really very in-depth work. She's moved on from that now, but her early work on citizenship in relation to military service in Canada illustrates extremely well the argument that some of us have also made, which is the argument that the military has actually been a key channel through which citizenship rights, especially for those marginalized, especially for those excluded, have been gained. But they have not been gained voluntarily or because the military or the state has had their interests at heart first and foremost. They have been gained through military labor. Military labor here has been a precondition for gaining citizenship rights. So citizenship involves something of a contradiction. We're aware of this from, again, long-standing in-depth work on citizenship in liberal societies, because citizenship involves more than just our liberties. Without some rights and obligations, this is an argument that goes back even to Hobbes, we would perhaps not have society. And we would perhaps all be in a state of war. You may agree with this, you may disagree with it. I'm just trying to indicate to you how long these debates have been going on about citizenship and about our various rights and obligations as citizens towards society. And it is helpful to, once in a while, compare civil-military relations with broad concepts of citizenship in liberal societies, especially the distinction between Republican and liberal understandings of citizenship. Please do not confuse this with the label of the Republican Party in the USA. And there are various further nuances to this, so I'm caricaturing the debate in terms of a contrast between Republican and more liberal understandings of citizenship, Republican understandings emphasizing obligations more, which however often also assumes some sort of a sense of a shared identity, some sort of a sense of being part of a generalizable community, political community, versus a more liberal understanding of the need to minimize commitment to society, minimize state involvement, and maximize individual liberties. It is very rare that we find these two positions in this raw form, so please do make a note that I am caricaturing this somewhat. Why am I caricaturing it? To give us a little bit of structure, to give us a structure that perhaps allows us to also understand how young people are differently drawn into military politics. And that is what I want to turn to now. The question, is military service, military enrollment, a question of age? Helen Brocklehurst, to whom I referred at the start, argues that it absolutely is. Children's politicization, she argues, is enabled precisely because it is also being simultaneously underplayed. And this contrast between the politicization and depoliticization of childhood and youth means that it actually guarantees the prolific and undisturbed abuse of children and young people in security practices. Helen Brocklehurst then argues that we ought to focus more on embodied generational relations of power that enable war. And in many ways here she addresses an underlying paradox that fellow colleagues within that field, that growing field of research on the militarization of childhood and youth, have really placed at the center of debates. How can it be that as Western societies, most societies, we place the well-being of children, at least rhetorically, at the center of so much politics? Children are used to legitimize all manner of political interventions. Even the politics of war is often justified by reference to the need to protect those who are constructed as the most vulnerable in society. How can it be then that it is exactly those most vulnerable, those constructed as most in need of protection, but they then carry out the hard work or are moved towards the hard work of protecting that society? How is it that they are endowed with that responsibility? This leads Alison Watson, to argue that in ignoring the significance of children to militarization globally, we do more than just ignoring children in their roles in military politics. We actually also ignore the significance of social and societal dynamics that, when taken together, may explain the true nature of violent conflict, whether in the global north or the global south. Okay. It's a little bit too sensitive. And so we may ask, with the French historian Michel Foucault, if society must be defended in the current age, an age which he, calls a biopolitical age, but where he traces the origins of biopolitics and biopower quite some way back. If we assume that society must be protected, then that begs the question of by whom, and of course, for whom, and for what purposes. Michel Foucault argues that power is relational, it is processual, it also operates at a micrological level and not just at the level of the power of the state, but I'll come to that in a minute. I do have a slight criticism of that assumption, but he primarily distinguishes between three different forms of power. He does not argue, however, that in society we only ever see the operation of any one of these. So what he is doing is trying to understand how these different forms of power exactly interconnect and intersect within certain contexts at certain moments of time. He argues that sovereignty, sovereign power is one of those big three. Discipline, as a focus particularly on individuals and the individual bodies, in particular through disciplinary techniques of punishment, is another key form of power. And what he calls biopower and governmentality. What he means by that, first of all, by biopower, is a governing through life. Governing by ensuring, or at least constructing politics as if it is conducted in the interest of enhancing our well-being, enhancing the well-being of the population. And so biopower in many ways does the opposite to disciplinary power by focusing on the well-being of a population. The individual here does not stand in focus. However, biopower in liberal societies, advanced liberal societies, increasingly works nonetheless through individuals, but through their self-responsibilization, through in many ways wanting to conduct themselves in a way that increases the well-being of society and of the population. And so the implication is that in advanced liberal societies, we find less and less evidence of the explicit use of disciplinary power. Using punishment, severe corporal punishment, for instance, in schools. The state is still present, but it retreats to some extent and operates through different mechanisms, mostly in order to maximize the well-being of society. Like I said, I do have some critiques of this, but I do find that the tripartite division of powers and then considering how they reconnect is actually helpful for trying to understand militarization. It helps us to see, first of all, the extent to which militarization is itself also used by state power in order to discipline individuals, in order to discipline society. And you might say, well, that's a thing of the past. However, I will show you some examples of where, in the current moment, the military is again used in order to discipline. In order to discipline especially those who do not quite seem to comply voluntarily with some of those biopolitical logics of self-governing, of conducting themselves in ways that are opportune and supportive of social well-being in neoliberal societies. So these are the individuals who might be failing in school, who might resist certain ways of self-optimization, who might be failing to be as resilient as neoliberal society might demand them to be. And you can see social division creeping into the argument here. For it is those individuals who are often structurally disadvantaged. And this is something that I find missing in Foucault. Structural disadvantage as something that actually continues to keep these different dimensions of power connected and makes them work in ways that reinforce social division. However, before being too critical of Foucault, let me acknowledge that Foucault himself also recognized, A, that the state continues to have a role to play, and B, that biopolitics, so politics in order to enhance the well-being of the population, nonetheless also leads to certain exclusions. It almost inevitably has to lead to certain exclusions from perhaps the right to live and to enjoy the benefits of living in a society that takes care of everybody's well-being. He also acknowledges that biopower, with its focus on life, in many ways produces what he calls a caesura of racism. Racism is helpful here in making us understand part of the argument, but Michel Foucault actually uses it in a more general way in order to point out the exclusions that are produced by biopolitics. Exclusions perhaps from the right to live, or at least exclusions from the obligation of the state to look after people's rights. So people who do not comply, who are not seen to be conducive to biopolitical life, might be implicitly excluded or very explicitly through a politics of death. And we can sadly relate this to young people, to children and young people. Relate to this by arguing that one of the caesuras that Michel Foucault here perhaps also has in mind, we don't know, is the caesura around the contradictory positioning of children and young people. But let me not move on too fast, for I also want to point out that sovereignty itself continues to, of course, play a key role in contemporary politics. Sovereignty has not retreated. Michael Dean illustrates this very well. Michael Dillon, I'll have to double check, likewise have emphasized for a long time now that sovereignty continues to be front and center, certainly of military politics. The sovereign state does continue to have an enormous amount of power, a power over, and not just a power for, a power to draw on us as citizens, as individuals, in the interest of certain state politics, political agendas. And in particular, in relation to children and young people, I want to point to the work of one other colleague, Lorraine Macmillan here, who also emphasizes the contradictions inherent in assigning the role of sovereign protectors to the quintessential victims of society. And she then argues that the sovereignty of the state is a vital part in the military enrollment of young people. It is insufficient to consider only disciplinary and biopolitical relations of power to fully understand exploitation and the role of young people in the military. And in the paper that Lucas and myself have written and recently published, which was included in the announcement for today's lecture, we then make that point even more strongly and refer also to the work of Mbembe in order to emphasize that when we're looking at military politics, we are looking at something quite specific. We are looking at the politics of death. And we are looking here at a politics that condemns some to death and others to being let die, being let go of. In our liberal advanced societies, we are also assuming that certain lives can be sacrificed, certain lives can be deemed less valuable than others. And we are partaking in a politics of death that reinforces and builds on global structural inequalities and disadvantages. Young people's recruitment for military work and intermilitaristic logics enables necropolitics, so the politics of death. And it is itself necropolitical. We could say that young people are being sacrificed here. They are being let die. But to some extent, we might even see signs that young people are not just let die, but made to die. They are a crucial part of that dynamic, and we feel that the work of Mbembe helps us to get at the severity of this dynamic in a way that Michel Foucault's work on biopolitics only does to some extent. Let me also say that we're very cautious here to not relativize. It is not our aim by using Mbembe's work to make out that the situation of young people in Western militaries is comparable to the severe apocalyptic scenarios that he is describing for post-colonial contexts. It's time for some examples, okay? I start with the place I know best. And perhaps at this point, I should also reveal something about myself to you, which is that although some of you are a step ahead of me, you've actually undergone military service. I grew up in Eastern Germany. Militarization was part of everyday life. And so in many ways in my lifetime, I have seen a change from an authoritarian society where militarization was unquestioned, where it was very difficult to resist military service in school, to resist military practice in school from an age of 14 at the very latest onwards, to a society which still had a military conscription in 1989, and then in 2011 abandoned. Not completely, but abandoned conscription, at least for a while. It is still part of the German constitution, and surprise, surprise, you probably know, Germany is one of the countries that is now reintroducing conscription at the moment with a light touch. And so over my lifetime, certainly, and over the last 15 years in particular, we have seen tremendous changes in not just military politics in Germany, but also exactly how young people have been positioned in that military politics. And even when the German parliament decided to, what's the right word? Ausgesetzt. To not implement conscription, constitutional conscription for a while. Even at that point, we already heard voices that argued, we do, however, need to make sure that we have enough personnel. And those debates and those voices, of course, have not gone silent. They have increased over the last several years now, certainly with the attack of Russia on Ukraine. Those voices have really gained momentum and gained in strength. But even in 2014, our then president, Joachim Gauck, somebody who represents part of the opposition movement from former Eastern Germany, by the way, argued that we Germans need to take up some of our responsibilities. We should no longer hide behind historical narratives of guilt. Yes, we have that history, so he is not a denier. Please do not misunderstand me. He's absolutely not a denier of German history and German guilt. However, he's one of the people who is arguing that we should no longer hide behind this narrative, but should start taking responsibility. And the narrative of responsibility, which is also part of a neoliberal discourse, being responsible, feeling responsible, that is something that is picked up again and again in German discourses and debates over military recruitment, military service, and now conscription. However, a key question, and something that really sums up some of the debates for me here, and especially today becomes even more obvious, is of course the question of responsibility. Okay, for whom, for what? What do we know about military politics? And so this is a little bit rhetorical. I apologize for that. As a researcher, I should be more careful, but I will use rhetoric for a while. I wonder whether the young people who in Germany now decide for military service, whether they have ever been presented with Germany's security doctrines from 2011, new security doctrines, which include strengthening transatlantic and European security and partnership, and enabling free world trade and free access to natural resources. By being a little bit rhetorical here, I want to emphasize something, and I think it's obvious at this point. It is that large question of how much are we actually engaged in democratic debate and in decision-making over what kinds of security and what kinds of military politics as an electorate, and certainly as young people who are disenfranchised when they are mostly addressed by the military to then take up military positions. To what extent are we engaged in this? How much do we know? How much are young people made aware of the aims and agendas of security doctrines, but also of alternatives, of other ways of doing security politics? What we've seen in Germany since 2011 could be broadly described as a neoliberal way of attracting young people to military service through playful subjectivities. Now, this hasn't gone without criticism, but of course, when you lose a conscript army, as a military, you have to make some decisions over where the personnel is supposed to be coming from, especially at an age and at a time when we are demographically an aging society. There are fewer and fewer young people available to do the job. And one of the ways in which the German military, with support from the defense ministry, has tried to keep numbers up and increase them is through various advertising campaigns. And you will not be surprised to see that these campaigns emphasize adventure, thrill, fun, perhaps exploring what some of the adventures and challenges are that can be found in military service. There has been a lot of criticism of this, especially when the Bundeswehr introduced so-called literal adventure camps for young people. But it hasn't abandoned this strategy, and it appeals, this is in German, I apologize for that, but it appeals mostly to young people in terms of their own interests, playful interests, excitement, thrill, age, activity, but also their sense of citizenship. Be an active citizen, be engaged, take responsibility for your own life and well-being and for the well-being of society. That has been very much the address towards young people. Young people, however, then are also approached as persons who might have their own interests first and foremost at heart, who might be looking for jobs and for career advancement. And so within the various official documents, we find both. We find this appeal to being a good citizen of society, and we find the appeal to individual interests. And that is where in neoliberal discourses, those two things actually interconnect. You can be a good citizen by being a good person to yourself, who is developing yourself. You will gain an attractive salary when you join the military. You will gain various social competencies, etc. You might develop some dream jobs. These are some quite old posters by now, but I just wanted to give you something to engage with, to actually get a sense of how the military here advertises itself to young people. Mostly it's in relation to, yes, taking responsibility, but also career advancement and thrill and activity. There is an element of social division even within Germany, where you could argue that everybody is addressed the same. When you drill into the detail, you see that some young people are specifically addressed because they have difficulties with their career advancement. So this is a quote from the military recruitment website. You can become a temporary soldier, so Soldat auf Zeit, without a school leaving certificate to inform yourself here. And so while on the face of it, we can all be good citizens, some of us could be even better citizens if we use the opportunity to improve our lot. Now, recently, I have already mentioned this, Germany has brought back to life conscription from within the constitutional rights, but conscription light. Conscription light meaning that all young men from the age of 18 now have to complete a questionnaire and they have to undergo a physical examination. They may then be approached directly by the military, but the hope at the moment of the Defense Ministry is that through this process, more young people will voluntarily take on a military career or voluntary military service without the need for full conscription, which would mean a forced conscription. There has been a lot of debate around this and various different positions. The SPD has been one of the parties that has argued that at least in this process we should acknowledge young people's own positions. Young people should get a voice in these debates, but overwhelmingly those debates have not happened. We have had very little reporting about young people's own positions on the reintroduction of conscription. So what we're seeing is in many ways a top-down process. It is sold as inevitable. We are in times of war, we are in times of increased risk. Usually the war in Ukraine is cited as evidence of this. But we do need to also be careful because, of course, reintroducing conscription and re-emphasizing the need for a standing army of a larger size does also bring the far right onto the agenda. Yeah, it's naive, it's illusionary to think that these arguments don't also become, in many ways, fodder for far right arguments over the need to finally move on, really properly move on from German guilt. You might have come across some of these unbelievable discourses, speeches by certain politicians within the AfD party in Germany, where, the history of German warfare and so on is just negligible. And so far-right populist arguments might also go in the direction of reinforcing the need to discipline our young people. Yeah, it's really convenient. You can reintroduce military disciplining on the back of these arguments for a larger standing army and generally addressing the alleged demographic gap. There's some confusion about numbers. Lucas and myself, we've tried, and we think it's interesting, that it's actually quite hard to understand the numbers. We are confronted with lots of numbers at the moment in the German discourses. The army needs 5,000 new recruits per year. That's the argument of Defense Minister Pistorius. But the ombudsman for the military, Breuer, argues that no, by 2030 we need 100,000 standing soldiers in the standing army, and therefore we need to recruit 20,000 soldiers per year. Currently, about 5,000 soldiers per year are newly recruited, if I remember rightly. I'd have to double check it. What we're having problems with here is that these numbers seem to not add up. They are quoted, they circulate. The argument is, okay, effectively, we need more people in arms. So, of course, our argument is, shouldn't we be told, shouldn't we be able to understand at least why allegedly we need more recruits up to that number, up to that figure? How do the numbers come about? There is a question also, though, about the actual state of the military. Military in Germany has seen a lot of criticism for continuing to have really quite poor conditions, especially for minors, especially for people with diverse backgrounds. It is not necessarily an attractive employer for some young people. And so the question begs, how and to what extent is the military itself transforming in order to reflect democratic society? What is it doing to protect those who are serving? Increasingly, what we're seeing is a connection also. A connection between the numbers and something larger. A connection to, you could say, almost nationalistic changes of mindset. Young people are not just asked to perhaps staff the army in increasing numbers, but to also change their mindset. politicians have introduced Boris Pistorius in particular the term of Kriegstüchtigkeit, so being able to wage war. Various opposition politicians have argued that perhaps we ought to use the word Friedenstüchtigkeit, being able to wage peace. But on the back of this, there is a question of mindsets, winning hearts and minds. Young people and society in general is being asked to show their responsibility by supporting the military and supporting militarization. They're being asked in particular to ask less about what am I having from this and what can I give to society. And yes, this includes a really thorny question, the recruitment of minors. The German military does recruit minors. You can apply for voluntary service from the age of 16 and a half. You can commence military service from the age of 17 with parental consent. And this practice has been critiqued over and over again by UNCRC, by the UNCRC Committee for the Rights of Children. We also did some calculating here, and we figured out that in fact, even though 17-year-olds make up only 1% of the 17-plus population in Germany, they do in fact make up almost 11% of all new recruits. And about a third of them leave the army after being recruited. Allegedly, so the ombudsman in parliament, because they are bored quite often, they find that service is far less attractive than what they were sold. But other reasons might also play a part. And of course we can ask, so if there is a recruitment shortage, what the heck is the military doing around those young people who have said, okay, yes, I'll sign up? The army says, okay, we acknowledge the criticism by UNCRC, by the committee, the UNCRC committee, but you know what? We need it. We need to recruit minors. That's it. That's all we're getting as an argument. We need it, therefore we'll do it. The state is here at the center and determines who is recruited. Right. I'm running out of time. Are you patient enough to look at some geography? Just a little bit. A little bit of geography, classic geography, because one of the things we've done is to look at the sites where the military actually finds young people. And it finds these young people in their everyday lives from a very early age, which also raises the question of minors. What about minors? These young people do not yet enjoy full citizenship right, but, surprise, surprise, they are confronted with the military, with career advisors, with youth officers, with militaristic advertising in various places around their everyday lives, not just in leisure sites, but also in school. So in sites that you would say we do have some element of control over. Now, the Bundeswehr has had this tool for a number of years. They've instituted youth officers who can be invited by schools to come into the classroom and basically teach young pupils, teach students about security politics. And the argument has always been that this should be part of democratic education. It is democratic to do this. It is democratic to make sure that young people get acquainted with the military and get to engage in some of the hard questions. Now, here comes a research challenge. It's extremely difficult to actually observe some of these classes. So in many ways, even though school is a public site, it is challenging for researchers to then observe what goes on in a classroom during these sessions. The teaching unions have argued that youth officers might be giving a balanced opinion, but even the fact that they turn up as officers, even the fact that they're representing the military, makes whatever they say far less biased. It also erodes the right of teachers to educate, teachers who have been educated to give a balanced opinion. And of course, youth officers present themselves as security experts, and in doing so, construct perhaps a hierarchy of securities. Some issues that might be security issues for young people will not be raised here. security becomes framed as military security, and youth officers become framed, and the state becomes framed as the security expert, not your peace activists, not your perhaps more critical veteran associations, not the unions, not young people themselves with their various interests, perspectives, and experiences, including experiences of violence. Schools do, to some extent, cooperate with the Bundeswehr. So some countries, states within Germany, 9 out of the 16, do have cooperation treaties with the Bundeswehr that specifically also allow youth officers to be invited into schools. But all of them, apart from Bavaria, prohibit explicit recruitment. So these youth officers are not to be confused with career officers. Bavaria has just changed this. So Bavaria now mandates schools to allow career advisors into the classroom, into school. Schools can no longer object. In addition to this, universities in Bavaria have also been obligated to cooperate and collaborate with the military if the military and the Ministry of State determines that this is required. Not Parliament. The ministry decides. We've also had a personnel task force for about a year with a large increase in investment in recruitment, and part of that strategy has been to go where young people go to inform themselves about careers, various career exhibitions, fairs, etc., including fairs specifically for girls, or the so-called Girls' Day, during which the agenda of the Girls' Day is to interest girls in technical professions. The military is present here and offers a wide range of activities. And of course, on social media. Some of this we've written about in a paper, the paper that, not in the paper, but in a book chapter that is forthcoming. So you can, if you're interested, perhaps read a little bit more soon in an edited collection by Marshall Bayer and Jana Tabak. I think I've run out of time, but when you see the slides, there is a link to the trailer for one of the social media videos that, or programs, documentaries that the Bundeswehr has recently produced. It keeps producing these fast-paced action, exciting life in the military, etc., pp, in order to attract young people to this profession, and it engages with them through its TikTok channel. It answers literally every single comment, every single question, presents itself as very open-minded, but we checked, rarely addresses the question of what the job is actually about. What about the ethics of killing? What about the risks of death in the military? And so even though this feels very democratic, when you drill into the detail, you can see that actually, in a very sly, rhetorical way, the space for democratic discussion is really limited on TikTok. Okay, I will come to an end and just briefly hint at other examples. One example is the UK. In the UK, we've had a combination, perhaps, of neoliberal citizenship agendas combined with disciplinary powers, especially for those unruly young people who do not conform and who perhaps could see the military as a way of developing their own careers. The military ethos program in the UK is a key example of that, and I will skip forward here to make sure that I'm not overstretching your patience, to the present, where you will find these military preparation colleges for training across the entire UK. The emphasis that I would like to make here is that many of these military academies are especially addressing young people from deprived backgrounds, and are promising them to develop life skills and competencies that they can allegedly not gain elsewhere. So in many ways, we could see a combination here between biopolitical neoliberal discourses on the one hand, but also disciplinary power, disciplining these unruly young people into becoming more compliant subjects through the military. We've also considered some other states. You can have a look at these examples in the paper that was advertised. I won't do that here, and I will instead, come to a conclusion. I know you're looking for this. With perhaps some reflections. These are reflections. This is not set in stone. I do not want to pretend that I have all the answers. I am actually really looking forward to a discussion with you now. Reflections, what are my reflections and our reflections, including Lucas in this? We can see a continuing impact of sovereign power, the power of the state on young people, especially in the context of militarization. We can see how it's entangled actually also with constructions of childhood that can be quite contradictory. Both constructions of childhood and different constructions of youth can be utilized to legitimize war. Protecting children as well as young people as being the perhaps ideal soldiers, fit, young, wanting to develop careers and so on. And it's not like this is set in stone. It shifts, it meanders, it allows different agendas to be fulfilled, but they all build up essentially on the gap, on the citizenship gap and on the democratic deficit. A democratic deficit that for children and young people builds on generational injustices and in many ways cements them. But there are many, many tensions, as I've tried to illustrate, in democratic citizenship, and I think that's where we can start. We can start with these tensions and with these contradictions, which are context-specific. Yeah? They're not the same, not even in Europe. By problematizing these tensions, we might be able to develop some alternatives, not just problematize, but think of other ways of doing things. Think of some alternatives. Start by working the gap, the citizenship gap. Work it perhaps by minimizing the spaces of unfettered access to young people by the military, and extend spaces of critical citizen engagement. This doesn't mean young people should not engage with the military. Explicitly, I would say, I don't see it that way. But it means building in perhaps some barriers. Taking up adult responsibilities, or say the responsibilities of fully enfranchised citizens, to perhaps buffer the access of the military to those who are not yet fully franchised. Note transgressions of the military into everyday spaces of childhood as a starting point to challenging militarization. And educate for dissent. In the words of Stitzlein, cultivate skills and dispositions that are necessary for the next generation of citizens to securely and successfully engage in political dissent. I misquoted her here. So to successfully engage in political dissent. And consider alternatives to military practice. Maybe you feel the same. I cannot tell you how often people have said to me, but the military is great. It's helped. It's helped my child. It's provided opportunities. It's been a wonderful route into a career. Now, who am I to argue with that? All I can do is argue that there's more. There is more, and there are so many ways in which young people who want to do this have an opportunity to serve society. They can, in Germany, do a voluntary social year. They can participate in community activities, in the youth fire brigades, in the Red Cross, become activists, and so on, so on. There are lots of ways for young people to be doing things that we might class as socially responsible. The military is not the only route. But there is a problem. This is my last slide. The problem for me is that we could, of course, argue that all of this is solved if we just say children and young people are all fully enfranchised citizens. That would mean I would have no arguments. If we consider children and young people as fully enfranchised, then they're fully informed, fully involved in democratic debate, and what's stopping the military in that case in addressing them for military service? Very little. And because that is a potential consequence of this sort of thinking, I would say, no, let's not go that far. Let us protect some space of childhood in which some democratic skills can be learned, in which information can be mulled over, in which debate can take place before children and young people commit themselves to giving up some of their rights. And let's keep focusing on the responsibilities of fully enfranchised citizens, adults, teachers, anyone who has some responsibility for the kind of foreign politics that we're involved in. And perhaps with Woodward and Duncanson also think through how militaries can be transformed. Perhaps that's part of the answer. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this stimulating thought. It gives a lot of food for thought. So we have good time for discussion now and questions and comments, any thoughts that you might have. There will be, I mentioned already, there will be some catering, some snacks and wine arriving, but not quite yet. So please have some, let's have some discussion. Who would like to go first? Okay, I'll keep.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Alexandra Middleton from Oulu Business School. I wonder if you noticed, are there any critical views on this rise of militarization and securitization in all institutions, and how are they received, and are they framed as unpatriotic when we have a war happening now in Europe? So I'd love to hear your reflections on that.
I would have to do a full discourse analysis, first of all, to really prove what I am saying, so take this with a pinch of salt. But my observation of the news on the main news program in Germany, the Tagesschau, is that reports about protests really disappear into the background. There is some reporting, but it's very limited. We had a strike, a pupils' strike a few weeks ago against the forced reintroduction of conscription. That was reported on, but without any further consequence. The unions, the main teachers' union, the GEW, Gewerkschaft Erziehung und Wissenschaft, it's a union that we as academics, as lecturers can also join, is very active and has protested against the introduction of the new law in Bavaria, for instance. They have taken the Bavarian state to court, so there were opportunities to also co-fund this and to become involved. So the teachers' unions in particular are a strong force criticizing these developments, but in public debate you hear very, very little. It's almost eerily quiet. I have heard of school protests, including in a town near to where I was brought up, where the school director actually expelled students who staged a protest while youth officers were in school. So that happens as well. And the main message is, yes, there is protest. You can also see it in public space, in sticker campaigns and so on. It's often coming from left-wing activist groups. But in terms of the overall public debate, there's very little. Yeah.
Thank you. There is one.
Hello, I'm Eva-Kaisa Brokkola. I'm from Geography Unit. Thank you very much for this very interesting and topical presentation. So this is of course very topical in Europe and Finland, and we are seeing how strongly it's integrated or becoming integrated in all institutions, and even like university funding and regional development funding, for example, is transferred to these dual-use infrastructures. And it's also quite interesting how, for example, this kind of left behind places, actually regions that in these previous years have not been felt that they are part of the growth. They are now taking advantage of these opportunities, actually. So this is very, in a way, contradictory. But yes, this was just to note how it's very powerfully present here. But I actually wanted to ask something about the final sentence of your presentation, because it gives us some hope and something like realistic, because it's very difficult to see that it will change in a short time. So if the military should be transformed, what kind of transformations and what kind of improvements and perhaps changes could take place that could somehow bring us to the better outcomes? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, I'm not going to cop out, but I am also curious to hear what you think. So my reflection on this starts with the situation of minors. For starters, I think until young people in our current society actually reach the age of maturity, and ideally for a period after that, because giving up your rights immediately to me is not legitimate. But before they reach that age, certainly there should be no military recruitment. I know this is context specific, and I'm not blinkered towards the fate of child soldiers in other contexts. My point is we have child soldiers here. We do have them in Germany, definitely. And so that is a place to stop. And before saying we need to transform the military so that they can accommodate child soldiers better, perhaps I should say I don't think this should happen in the first instance. But if it does, then of course we need trained personnel. We need much, much better services for these young people. At the moment, apparently there is one officer specifically responsible for those young recruits, but they are otherwise fully part of normal military life. There is very little special welfare support for young people in relation to perhaps their age-related interests and needs. So for those people who would say, no, we need to continue to recruit minors, then the argument would be improve the services for minors and make sure that you are basing that on evidence as well. For everybody else, a military that is a democratic military should never avoid debate with us, for starters. It should engage with us. It should engage in forums where there is controversial debate and where other arguments can also be presented. And it is a military that is more transparent and more open towards its recruits than it currently is. It clearly is not. Of course, we don't have a clear insight into this, but the reports of the parliamentary ombudswoman speak volumes. Recruits leave because the military is completely different to what they imagined it would be. They are particularly confused by the lack of activity, by the fact that they end up sitting around all day doing nothing. So expectation management, one might say, but also within the military, what happens? What exactly are the competencies that young people gain? To what extent do they tie in with social values of democratic citizenship? In a UK context, not an EU country anymore, of course, I would also say it's really problematic to exclude soldiers from the general enfranchised population. That's deeply problematic, but that's a whole different situation. Diversity. The military is just not able to provide protection for diverse communities. LGBTQ plus individuals in the military continue to suffer horrendous abuse. It's extremely difficult. And so even though the military promises us to transform and reform, they don't, and they're very secretive about this. There was an in-depth study of diversity in the German military, and it took the Ministry of Defense many years to actually publish this. And when they did, they published a report that doesn't even have a date on it, and you can read into the data some of the complications, but it's not a pretty picture.
Thank you. So, okay, Lauri, you.
Hello, Lauri Moilanen from Oulu University, so History of Sciences and Ideas. Thank you, this was very interesting for me, even though I don't know about the field, anything about it, basically. But here in Finland, we have compulsory education until the age of 18, and I'm not sure is military allowed to campaign in schools. I don't know if somebody knows better, you may discuss it, but how the education law works in Germany. Yeah.
So in Germany, it really is by invitation of the school, of a teacher, to a youth officer. Teachers, individual teachers, may also decide to take their classes to a careers fair. That happens without many restrictions, so individual teachers can also decide this, but there's no compulsory military education. So it is very much by invitation of a teacher, depends on what kind of school you're going to and what the collegium in the school decides. There is otherwise in the curriculum, politics, social sciences, but no compulsory military education in that way. Partly, I am guessing, because we do have memories of times and states when that has been different. So when I grew up in Eastern Germany, military service was part of my education from very early on. We were made to participate in maneuvers. It was very gendered along binary lines. So the girls did what you might say catastrophe management. So we were taught how to rescue people and effectively take on those Red Cross activities and so on. And boys were, learning how to use a weapon was compulsory. And rejecting that, resisting it, extremely difficult. We have got memories of that past, and of course of a past that is even more problematic. And that is why a lot of schools have resisted, but not all have. And perhaps the message here is it's pretty unregulated, apart from Bavaria now, and apart from these cooperation treaties, whereby schools are then allowed to cooperate with the military and invite youth officers in. In Bavaria now we have a state that obligates schools. Okay, but it's not part of the formal curriculum, and you could say that's part of the problem. In France, perhaps people would say, well, that is part of the problem, because it's not part of the curriculum. It's also less possible to contest it on the parts of other teachers, on the parts of trained pedagogical personnel.
Hello, thank you so much for a really inspiring presentation. I'm Katja Castillo, I come from the Faculty of Education and Psychology, so I think it's a nice bridge. You mentioned in your speech that in Germany, the military does not address the job description, so they don't describe what is it that you come to do when you are recruited. And this made me think, I participate at the moment in a research project called Small Matters, where we focus on the study of multi-species death and dying in primary school age children. So we talk about death and dying with children who are at the age of 6, 7, and 8 years old. And this made me wonder how much of a taboo the topic of death is in childhood and in young people's lives, in our education systems. So we are, in Finland, the national core curricula for basic education mentions death once in the first primary education years, first grade. Then after that, it doesn't mention death at all. So that was kind of my question. How might this hinder informed decision making? So I don't know about Germany and the context where you've studied, but do you see that death as a topic in childhood and youth is a taboo? And how could we overcome that? How could we work that gap?
It's a really important and really interesting question. Partly in engaging with the term necropolitics, the politics of death, we have reflected on it, but not really written it through, because I think it needs a better understanding of ethics. Krebs, whose first name I've forgotten, argues also that we should consider ethical injury as a part of this kind of necropolitics and what military recruitment, forced military recruitment in particular, might entail. We could consider it as entailing an ethical injury, where our sense of ethics is breached. And here again, we're in that spectrum between voluntary conscription on false pretenses, voluntary military service on false pretenses, to full conscription, forced conscription without conscientious objection, which, by the way, in a school context is really difficult. This is one of the issues in schools. You cannot just conscientiously object. It's very, very difficult because of this the need to go to school. But sorry, I am going back to your question there, because the issue of discussing death and discussing violence, I think, is related to this, and it's part of filling that gap actually, or keeping it open, because of various culturally specific, perhaps also taboos on talking about death and dying. That gap can be exploited. Yeah, it is there. I would not abolish this gap. I think having a discussion about how we talk about death and violence is something that we ought to have. It's not something we should just decide. It should be informed by psychological research, but it is also something that we decide culturally through discussion and perhaps by developing different ways of speaking about death and violence. Speaking about death and violence with children is possible. It is possible even with children who are survivors of violence or who are still undergoing and experiencing extreme traumatizing violence. There is some research which shows this, even qualitative research with children has been conducted. So it is not impossible, but it is an ethical question that I would keep open. But make sure that when we're having these discussions, the military cannot simply exploit it by saying, well, we cannot confront young people with the question of death, possibly. It's unethical to do so. Therefore, we carry on presenting a sanitized image of the job. So, yeah, keep the gap in that context.
There is.
Hi, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. I'm Juhari Rampää from the Research Unit of Geography. I'm curious about thinking about citizenship and citizenship studies. The discourse of migration is very strongly present in this as a part of citizenship itself, and in German society today, migration is a much discussed topic. How much it is present in your research agenda?
We looked at it in the context of analyzing those TikTok comments, and we were really struck by the numbers of young people who wrote to the Bundeswehr Karriere channel in response to one of those documentaries, who explicitly stated that they had come to Germany as refugees and asylum seekers and wanted to join the army to give something back. So in many ways actually fulfilling all of those ideal categories of an active citizen who is willing to carry out military service as part of a service to the community, the wider community. And here the answer is very clear. You cannot join the military until you have full citizenship. So full citizenship in terms of having all the papers in place is a prerequisite. You cannot join the German army without full citizenship. And that also perhaps addresses some questions around diversity and how prepared the army is, how prepared, okay, careful here, German society at large, but perhaps dominant discussions within Germany are to incorporate the notion that people who do not have full citizenship, who may never have full citizenship, can join the army and can take on those kinds of roles. So in that context, it has made an appearance in our research. We've come across it. In relation to other areas of migration, I am not so sure. There is, of course, a parallel discussion about border reinforcement. We, for many years now, fueled partly by the far-right populist party, AfD. I'm allowed to say that, at least in parts, I have to say in parts, an extremist party. We've had these discussions about the alleged need for violence along the border to protect the border. And so, of course, that could become part of a role for military personnel. So there is a connection there, but I can't say much more about it. We've not explored it.
Okay, maybe I ask something now. Been thinking about this very large question about militarization. As Eva has already mentioned, this is a very topical issue here in Finland. There's a lot of talk about security, securitization in terms of discourse and relation to law, and also in the university where we should engage in this kind of dual use research practices. But given that it's interesting to make this comparison between different countries, Finland, Germany, and you said you have background in DDR, GDR as well, where I guess was very somehow militarized country. And I'm sort of thinking and going back to the very basic questions, and initially you showed some definitions of militarism. And I'm wondering, of course we can think about society at large and then young people in particular, but where is the moment where we can start talking about that something has become militarized? For example, Finland has conscription, and for male and not for females, but they can also voluntarily join. But it has been, I guess, always in Finland, so it's not an option. And a question is a conscription itself a form of militarization? And maybe on the basis that whatever the needs are for it, it still affects the mind of young people and forms the minds of citizens for the future. And I guess that's conscription is the real topical in Germany for you. So how would you go responding?
I'd have to think about it a little bit more, but I think if you understand militarization as a process, then at the moment it is. The moment when it's naturalized, it's been in place for a long time, we might not say it's militarization anymore, but basically militarism, because it's part of everyday life, it's become accepted. That military service is a precondition for full citizenship, and everybody, or at the moment, people read as male, have to conduct that service. At the moment, interestingly enough, there should be more debate, but the issue of reintroducing conscription, of course, also does cause some debate. It's certainly part of militarizing society in terms of instilling this different mindset, in terms of convincing the German voting population, at least, that we need to be able to conduct war, Kriegstüchtigkeit. There's more to it. I can't translate the term. I mean, it's really putting a very positive spin on it. And in that sense, conscription is also part of teaching us about the military, teaching us a particular version of security politics. In that sense, I would say, yes, it is part of militarization. Maybe we need to be more worried when that process is complete and we've normalized and naturalized it so much that we live in a militaristic society, we have militarism, and it's normalized. It's no longer a process, it's no longer contested.
Yes. Thank you. We can have, Marika. Marika has a few more questions, and then.
Thank you. So my name is Marika Kettunen, and I have a quick note and a question. So the note is just referring to the previous discussions and the question about kind of how military is present in schools, and in Finland we do also see kind of growing interest in educating the youth and educating young people, not by by the military itself, but like voluntary defense associations, and specifically targeting young people 16 and above. So definitely involving minors, and kind of in the name of this Finnish notion of comprehensive security and preparedness and preparing the society. This is something that we are currently studying in our project. So if someone is also doing something on this or interested, we will be happy to connect. But also something that Kathrin said during her lecture was that this kind of idea of security and national security very easily becomes entwined with militarism. And it's really difficult to kind of even think of what is national security beyond military activities. And this is also something that we are kind of interested in looking at. How is this mobilized in Finland? Because this idea of comprehensive security in a way is kind of expanding the idea of security. But anyways, so this is the note and then the question. Kind of if you think of young people in the security agenda, like more widely in Germany, this is definitely something that's very timely and very important. But like, could you maybe give us some examples, or are there other ways like how young people are kind of visible in the security agenda in Germany today? Like, is it mainly this type of like external security, or are there any debates about like so-called internal security or that sort of things?
Thank you very much. I'll have to think about that as well when I get home. My, again, not research-based answer is no, or very little. Maybe this is something to do with the construction of German society, or certainly the kind of professionalization of a lot of areas of catastrophe management, disaster management. Young people are often involved in that as volunteers. There's a lot of volunteering in the fire brigades, in the Red Cross, in the technical support services, and so on. But it's not really something that we talk about specifically. We don't have much of a discussion about what is the role of young people in these support services, disaster management services. We do have a lot of discussion over whether German society is prepared. And so the Home Secretary in the Home Ministry of Interior Affairs has issued for several years now a list of what people are supposed to have at home, and usually we laugh about it. So you find more reflection on this actually in the satire programs, political satire, than debate amongst the public. And my sense at the moment is that the more of a crisis discourse we have, the more of that perhaps is taken up and naturalized. We see that when people start to invest in solar because the Strait of Hormuz is closed. You know, people do respond, and it connects in those discourses, or they make connections between what politicians might have been telling them to do and what they are seeing around them, their own interpretations of geopolitics and how it affects their lives. But we do not, at the moment, as far as I can tell, problematize the position of young people in those services. And there is still a certain sense of, oh, please, are you having me on, really? 3 cans of beans and 20 liters of water will get me through a crisis? And yet, I'm being flippant about this. We have near Bonn, just like 5 years ago, we had the severe flooding with high, for Germany, high fatalities, not by global standards, but certainly for Germany, high fatalities. And it has raised some of the consciousness of those kinds of politics of preparedness, but it's also become very localized. And in fact, people living in that area, we have a project in that region at the moment. People living there feel very much neglected. They feel as if their experiences are not part of a wider discourse.
Thank you. Okay, if you have still some burning question, now is still time just about to ask it. I'm gonna squeeze one more. I was wondering, did you make a link between militarism and liberalism or neoliberalism? Because I think that one might think that they pull apart. Liberalism is the focus on the individual and rights and what I make out of my life, and militarism towards being one of collective or unity to even sacrifice oneself. So, yeah.
Yes, indeed. We do, Lucas and myself do in the paper, because it also is a puzzle. In many ways, it raises the liberal puzzle. How can we convince people to do something like join the military and defend the country when at the same time we are a liberal democracy and everybody should be free and their own interest and their own security should come first in their own lives? How is the connection produced to security of the individual and security of society? That is also a contradiction, and I don't think even political theorists have resolved it. If you are a political theorist, please correct me. My sense is it just hasn't been resolved. Neoliberalism, however, of course, speaks to something else, something more Foucauldian, which is that what we take to be liberal is not free will. It is something that is heavily circumscribed. We are made into subjects who understand themselves as individuals, but not really free individuals, individuals who are charged with lots of responsibilities, and their primary responsibility being further the well-being of society by looking after yourself. Make sure you get ahead in life, make sure you develop a good career. That way you are also doing something for society. And so that connection in neoliberalism is one where we do see a way in which militarization can intersect with those discourses. It seems like a contradiction, but it really is not, and we have plenty of examples of the military explicitly taking up some of those neoliberal definitions of identity.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Okay, any more questions? Okay, no more questions, and thank you. The whole talk was fascinating. Thank you so much again, and let's thank Kathrin. And now, please.